Good evening and welcome. My name is Michael Hunter Schwartz, and I'm the Dean of the McGeorge School of Law. And I want to welcome you to what, as far as we can tell, is the 9th annual Mike Belote Lecture. So I'm going to do about 30 seconds of bragging about McGeorge, then I will, and that'll include some bragging about Aaron O'Neill, and then I will do a little thank you to Mike Belote, and then we'll get started. So we are so thrilled that you're here. We believe that this is the largest number of RSVPs we've ever had for a Mike Belote lecture, so kudos to you. I do see an extraordinarily large number of brilliant McGeorge students. We are thrilled that you are here. Our most popular concentration at the law school is our capital concentration, and that makes a lot of sense because knowing our students, what they want to do is make a difference in the world. And they're an absurdly inspiring and brilliant group of people. So we are absolutely thrilled that all of you are here, including the students. My one brag, and perhaps a few of you have heard me mention this before, but McGeorge is now ranked the #1 government law school in the country. Wow. And if you've been staring at the ceiling late at night wondering, how could it be that McGeorge is the #1 government law school in the country? Well, a huge part of the reason is the woman to my immediate left, Erin O'Neill. Erin is the director of our Capital Center for Law and Policy. She also directs our concentration in capital lawyering, and she directs about 43 other things at the law school. If you ever want to read what a human couldn't possibly do, read her list of titles on the law school's website, and you can get a sense of impossibility. And the really spooky thing is that she does it all extraordinarily well. One of the great things about being a dean is when someone else is taking care of something and you don't have to think about it. You just know that it'll be done extraordinarily well, and that is how Erin does every single thing. So you are lucky to have her as our moderator for tonight, and I cannot thank her enough. This may be one of the last few times I can do so publicly, so I wanted to make sure I squeezed that in. The last thing I want to do is to thank Mike Belote. He is probably like in the dictionary under the definition of engaged alumnus. He has been involved in our PLSS for forever. He's been an incredible supporter of the law school in 1,000 different ways. He has annoyingly responded to my calls and texts on a regular basis, and is also a good, kind, humble, smart human being. And so if you could all just join me in applauding Mike, I'd appreciate it. And with that, I will leave you to what I have already promised, our able hands, Erin O'Neill.
Thank you so much, Dean Schwartz. We so appreciate your support in the Capitol Center and Mike Belote for being the founding donor for this lecture series. It's fantastic to see you all here. I'm excited to have this conversation this evening. We have a really distinguished panel of folks with lots of different perspectives on these issues. As Dean Schwartz mentioned, I'm Erin O'Neill. I'm the director of the Capital Center for Law and Policy here at McGeorge, and also our Capital Lawyering Concentration, which is a program of study. Many of our students are here and alumni for students interested in working at the intersection of law and public policy. And this evening, for our 2025 Mike Belote Capital Center Lecture Series, we are focused on democracy and transition and the moment in which we find ourselves where governmental institutions are being reevaluated, re-envisioned, and we find an extraordinary level of distrust and division in our electorate. So having a conversation about that from a variety of perspectives seemed important. We have on our panel this evening a law professor, Tara Grove. She is the Vinson and Elkins Professor of Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Cheryl Boudreau, who's a professor of political science at UC Davis. Anita Chabria, who is a columnist, California columnist for the LA Times, and Mike Madrid, former political director of the California Republican Party, current political consultant and author of The Latino Century. So our goal this evening is to have a conversation that kind of spans a number of topics related to the current political moment that we find ourselves in, and we will certainly be allowing time for Q&A at the end. So please do think about questions that you have for our panelists, because this is meant to be a conversation. So I'm going to kick things off with our first question, which is basically setting the table for the moment that we find ourselves. Many have said that this is an unprecedented time of democracy in transition, government in transition. From each of your research and perspectives, what do you think makes this moment unique and different from where we have been before as a country? And I don't know who wants to lead us off.
I'll go.
There we go.
We're in trouble. You know, unprecedented is a word that has lost all meaning because it's been run over so many times. It's just roadkill at this point. So to me, it's not really about Democrat or Republican or left or right or woke or not woke. It's the simple violation of our laws over and over and over again with impunity, and then the lying about that violation to the point where there's a whole portion of the country that has lost track of the truth. I spoke with one of my elderly Indian uncles in Ohio today who wanted to tell me that there's tens of thousands of 150-year-olds on Social Security, and that the money is being funneled to NGOs and then disappears from there. This is a smart guy. He believes it. He just absolutely believes it. And so for me, the peril of this moment is that unprecedented doesn't cover it, and half of the country doesn't understand it.
Mike, do you want to just go next and we'll come down the line?
Yeah, look, I agree and second that motion on everything. I will say, broadly, I don't think democracy is doing well in the digital age, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And the reason really, in my estimation, is because while we built this beautiful, elaborate, elegant system of checks and balances toward the latter part of the 1700s, just as the emergence of the industrial age was upon us, it worked fabulously. We created these new institutions for this new age that really defined our human interactions and the way society was going to work. Once the hierarchical nature of institutions began to collapse broadly, and I think most of them have, government being the last one because of the civil service and bureaucracy and our system of laws, we began to realize that the way we have known and practiced democracy, maybe specifically or particularly, I should say, American-style democracy, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because we have, unfortunately, evolved or devolved to a place where people either feel the right to their own set of facts, or they're fooled into their own set of facts and evidence, and there's no longer a commonality upon which we base the decision-making process that we do, both individually and perhaps most importantly as a community. One other quick thing, without getting too nerdy on this, but there's two classical writers that I'm spending a lot of time reading right now. The first is Cicero, because Cicero really understood the emergence of tyranny before Julius Caesar took office, and wrote extensively about what was coming. And a lot of what he wrote was essentially pulled together by Adams and a number of the founding fathers to create the system of government that we have today. And there's a lot of really good lessons to be learned from reading Cicero if you're so inclined to read Cicero. If you're not, I would strongly recommend reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, because the premise of what makes the American experiment so special is the idea of all politics being local. It was local government. It was local geographies developing communities of interests that allowed the whole balance and checks and balance system to work in a practical political sense. And in the digital age, all politics is national now. Tip O'Neill's famous adage, whatever the right word is, that all politics is local, has basically been changed, disproven, since he wrote that book in the 80s, 90s. And that creates a very odd set of motivations for those in elected office. But the most troubling is the fact that the accountability is no longer to the voters in your district who send you there. And when that happens, we end up with this maelstrom of information and communities in the virtual world that make the way that we have practiced democracy impractical. I would argue really we're kind of living in this sort of zombified notion of what has worked in America for the last 250 years, and it no longer does. We are, I think, spending a disordinate amount of time trying to get back to an old system that was failing before, as opposed to reimagining a new way of protecting constitutional rights, engaging in democracy, and establishing and building firmer communities of interest in this new era that our species has entered. It's not just an American phenomenon, it's a human problem. And so I think the title of this talk, Democracy in Transition, is very, very apt. I think a lot of what we have known as American democracy in many ways is more behind us than coming as a problem, and I think we haven't recognized that yet as a country.
So I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I do think it's hard when you're living in a moment to know whether it's truly unprecedented. I think it's very hard to take stock of any moment until you're a few decades past. There have been many moments in American history that have been extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily partisan like our own. So when I started teaching constitutional law, I teach a case called Marbury versus Madison. Some of you may have heard of it, from 1803. And you know, one of the great things about this current moment is, thanks to the musical Hamilton, which just went through Austin, Texas, by the way. Thanks to the musical Hamilton, my students have some familiarity with the politics of the time, and the Federalists and Democratic Republicans hated each other, and they believed that if the other party took power, that would be the death of American democracy, right? The other party was so evil, so terrible. And Lin-Manuel Miranda does a really good job bringing this out. As I tell my students, my life would be complete if he would also write a musical about Marbury versus Madison, which is a really, really cool case. But I say all of this just to emphasize that American democracy has been through a lot. It's going through a lot right now, and I don't want to downplay that. But I think it's really hard for us to know if this moment is truly worse than many of the other truly tumultuous times that we've seen. Not just the fights over the election of 1800, but also the period leading up to the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, the period of massive disenfranchisement of a huge portion of our citizens that did not start to get rectified until 1964 and 1965. The fact that much of our citizenry could not vote for many, many years. Our democracy has faced a lot of challenges in the past, and that I offer in part to give us hope that whatever challenges we face today are things we can actually overcome.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, I just want to pick up on some of the themes from the previous speakers, particularly Tara's point about, is this an unprecedented moment? I think it is unprecedented in terms of, the current government climate is one of declining trust. Trust in government is going down, trust in its institutions, elections, politicians, fellow citizens. But if you kind of look broadly and look historically, these sort of distrust has been kind of on the rise for some time, right? We're at this kind of low moment, but on a lot of these things, right? Trust in elections, trust in Congress, right? These things have been kind of going down for some time, right? A well-known finding in political science is that everybody likes their individual congressman, but they hate Congress, right? And they don't trust it to do what's right. So I think that these sort of broader trends in kind of distrust are not particularly new. But I do want to highlight two things that I think are unique in this current moment. One is, I think, to the extent to which even nonpartisan things are becoming very partisan. And so, right, we talk all the time, right? We know that Democrats and Republicans have very different policy views, but increasingly, it's been more than that. And it's been, we're disagreeing about things that we used to all agree about. Just to take a couple of examples from sort of the work that I do or that I'm familiar with, voting by mail. What a boring, nonpartisan issue, or at least it used to be. And now Democrats and Republicans disagree about whether they should vote by mail, whether it's secure, right? This kind of partisan gap on something that used to be nonpartisan is now quite a big gap. Vaccines. We used to all agree that we should go get vaccines. And during the middle of a pandemic, when there was that vaccine that was developed, there were very different partisan views and very different uptake among partisans. And so I think that is something unique. So we might have these kind of broader trends in distrust that we've seen, but I think that's something that's relatively new. The second thing I'll just highlight is something that Mike mentioned in his comments, which is this kind of digital age, this age of social media, the proliferation of news sources. And so I think what's different from historical moments that Tara talked about is that now we're not all getting the same facts. We're not watching the same channels. People can wall themselves off from things that they don't like. You can get your news from a podcast now. You can go on one of the 50 million cable news channels. And so I think that is different because increasingly people aren't getting the same information, and they have just a really unique ability these days to kind of pick and choose and pick things that are consistent with what they already believe. And so I think those are two unique aspects in kind of a moment in history that in many ways kind of reflects some historical trends that Tara talked about.
So this one I'll start with you, Cheryl, and then maybe we can go back down the line. But as far as and it's an interesting concept, right? Is this truly unprecedented? What we see in terms of the level of distrust and polarization is certainly very present in our current political climate. How do you see that playing out for each of the branches of government, and how do those areas intersect, and how are they different in terms of executive, legislative, and judicial? We see a lot of different kinds of interaction between the branches these days, and just wondering what you think about this moment in terms of affecting that interaction.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I mean, you certainly, with respect to sort of polarization, you certainly see this going on in Congress, right? So if you look kind of historically, right, Congress has become more polarized along ideological lines, right? Republicans have kind of, right, Congress as a whole has become more conservative, and then you've seen this kind of increasing sort of difference in kind of, right, this sort of broadening gap among partisans in Congress. And then, I think that's really, kind of affected sort of the interplay among the branches.
Tara, did you want to?
Right, and I think one of the things that Cheryl and I were talking about earlier is this idea that political scientists have of effective polarization, right? That it's not just that the parties are split, it's actually more that people are very distrustful of someone from the other political party. So a Democrat thinks, well, if you're a Republican, then you believe X and Y and Z and it's all bad. And a Republican thinks, if you're a Democrat, you believe A, B, and C and it's all bad. Which actually may not be true. I think people are actually a little more complicated than the perceptions, but the perceptions are there. And one of the things I have found, getting to the branch of government that I study the most, this really affects the federal judiciary. In order for the federal judiciary to function, right, people need to believe that the judges are making decisions on the law. When I talk about judicial independence, I say that judicial independence requires at least two kinds of independence. One is what we sometimes call decisional independence. That is, a judge can make a decision without having to worry about being attacked personally, not having to worry about violence, which is a real concern in other countries, not have to worry about an impeachment attempt, or just budget cuts or something else. So that's decisional independence. But perceived independence is really important too, right? The belief among the citizenry that judges are making decisions based on the law and not based on their ideological background. And what I see are, many people still believe this, right? But there are increasing attempts by political actors and others to basically cut against this vision of the judiciary. So I suspect many of you heard President Trump say about a judge who ruled against him, quote, "This judge, like many of the crooked judges I am forced to appear before, should be impeached," end quote. Chief Justice Roberts, in a rare public statement, responded and said, quote, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision." That was an overstatement. And he went on to say, "The normal appellate process exists for that purpose," end quote. Now, this is obviously one example of one politician, and those of you who remember the first Trump presidency know that President Trump did this before, right? Talking about Obama judges and so-called judges, and Chief Justice Roberts responded then too. But this is not coming from one side only. So after President Trump appointed many, many members of the federal judiciary, 250, members of the Democratic Party, and I am quoting from senators, said the courts were, quote, "now packed with far-right extremists, most of whom were chosen not for their qualifications or experience, which are often lacking, but for their demonstrated allegiance to Republican Party political goals," end quote. Now, why do I mention these things? Because neither Republicans nor Democrats are talking about all judges. Conservatives and Republicans, to the extent they attack the judges that rule in ways that they don't like. Democrats and other progressives attack the judges that rule in ways that they don't like. And so they're basically saying, well, you are a truly independent judge if you rule the way I like, and you're not an independent judge when you rule the way I don't like. That's a kind of effective polarization for our federal judiciary. And I highlight this because to the extent this continues, this is extremely dangerous, not only for judicial independence, but for the rule of law. And I think it's important to recognize that this has been happening for quite some time by political actors from both political parties and other places through many administrations. Many Democrats still believe that the federal judiciary is packed with conservatives. It's actually not. President Biden appointed a whole bunch of people to the federal judiciary, and to the extent you believe that the appointing president matters at all to the makeup of the federal judiciary, it's extraordinarily split. And one of the things I want to suggest is maybe it doesn't matter. That maybe many of the judges, and I would say vast, vast majority of federal court judges, are trying to rule on the law regardless of who appointed them to the bench and regardless who the parties are before them. And I say this because it has become so common for people to believe that judges are partisan. I think they are not, and I think it is deeply dangerous when any political actor describes them that way.
Mike.
I'm not as convinced of the idea that judges are somehow nonpartisan actors. I think that by and large they are partisan actors. I also happen to believe that Roberts specifically and the members of his court have done far more damage to the judiciary than either Republicans or Democrats have done. I think when you have Clarence Thomas and the actions of his wife and what was taken, which we don't need to go in that, but that alone, the fact that it's basically from a political perspective, essentially swept under the rug, and we're not going to deal with it. Just the corrosive nature of what that did to the courts. Historically, over the past, the decline in institutions, all three branches of government, has really been commensurate or correlate to the rise of mass communications. So when Gallup was first polling people on the presidency or on Congress, really we didn't see that decline in institutional support until the late 40s. And it has been basically a slope downwards, okay? The court has always been, of all three, the most, I don't want to say revered, that's probably too strong of a word, but it has held the most institutional support, trust, and confidence of the three branches of government. That is no longer the case today. And I'm not suggesting that the politicians have helped. They've certainly done damage, but I think it's irrefutable that this court specifically has done incredible damage to itself, not necessarily because of its obvious partisan ruling, the partisan makeup, which is not atypical, but because of the actions of certain members and the involvement and the lack of response from the judiciary to say, wait a second, this is inappropriate, this is wrong, right? We have had Supreme Court justices resign in the past for far, far less I don't recall his name, but during the Nixon administration, I think was the last time that there was a resignation for really what today would look like a small slap on the wrist compared to what we just experienced. And I think that when the judiciary gets into the trouble that it's in the court of public opinion, we are truly in unprecedented territory, at least within modern memory with modern polling techniques. To the broader question of the Congress, I think is acting, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, I think are acting very predictably given the dynamics I think are happening in this digital age. The executive is getting far, far, far stronger simply because it's pressing the envelope and saying, what are you going to do about it? Not just the judiciary, which we are coming to quickly understand there's not much they can really do about it, right? But the Congress itself has been so complicit in handing over executive power. Again, it predates Trump, but it's on steroids now with Donald Trump. And when you have that breakdown of the legislative body, of the House of Representatives and the Senate, which is degraded, I think, to a point where, as I mentioned, one of the really troubling dynamics as a political consultant is recognizing that the strength of the political leadership, my good friend Kevin McCarthy, we're not good friends now, but we were back when we were in Young Republicans together. But, it was the weakest speaker in modern history. Marjorie Taylor Greene had advantage by opposing him. Every member of his caucus could raise more money by taking on and challenging his leadership, because all of the gateway tools that a speaker used to have at his or her disposal, which was the access to money, the committee appointments, all of the tools of discipline have been completely upended. And so when you are in an environment where a speaker can't control his or her own caucus, certainly unless it's done by sheer will or smarts, which Nancy Pelosi was able to do, but where Kevin McCarthy and John Boehner and Paul Ryan and now Mike Johnson cannot, you have an incredibly weak branch of government that is essentially handing over their ability to operate to the President of the United States, who is whipping votes to deliver congressional action because the leadership can't do it themselves. So what was designed as this checks and balance system has become completely unwound, based, I think, foundationally on the corrosion and or erosion of the lack of confidence and trust of the public in each one of those institutions, to a historic low, certainly in modern times.
I'm going to be honest, I can't remember the original question, so I'm just going to wing it. I'm going to agree on everything and disagree. So I think Tara is right. I actually think that whether they are, what their personal beliefs are, I believe most of our federal judiciary tries to be nonpartisan. I think there's always exceptions to that, and I think we could probably name a couple, Eileen Cannon and here if we wanted to, but I think, though, that the Supreme Court has done tremendous damage, both to reputation and in action, to how all of us think of the judiciary in this country. But I think, to me, the biggest challenge right now is when words turn to action. So it's absolutely true that both sides have attacked our judges and single out judges, and we see that back to the Trump term, we see that on the first Trump term, we see that on the Democratic side. But now there is an organized campaign to remove those judges that they do not like. And if you're missing that, I encourage you to really pay attention to what J.D. Vance is tweeting, to what Elon Musk is tweeting. In the next 3 months, you will see an attempt to remove judges. 100%. They've already begun that. And if we sit back and allow a single judge to be removed, just one, it doesn't matter if you like them or don't, the whole thing falls. That door is open, and then we lose the protection of the rule of law. And that truly, to me, is the terror of this moment.
So building on this sense of disunity that we've been talking about, during our planning conversations, we had an interesting moment where we talked about what bipartisanship actually even means today, that it is sort of at the idea of bipartisanship is at perhaps an all-time low. The parties themselves are fractured and factioned within the parties, almost mini parties. What does the concept of bipartisanship mean in this current moment?
Yeah. Is that you want me
Go
to
right
say?
ahead, yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a good question. Bipartisanship, something we haven't seen a whole lot of lately. I mean, I think the term, I think it means what it's always meant, right? Members of both parties working together to achieve a certain goal. That goal might be passing legislation in Congress. It might be building trust in elections at the local level. And in sort of lower levels, I think, sort of local government, maybe we're more likely to see sort of some sort of bipartisanship and people of different parties working together. At the national level, I think things look really different. And so on the one hand, you would think we would see bipartisanship, right? There's these razor-thin margins, especially in the House. And so you would think, okay, the parties are going to have to work together. At the moment, we're not seeing a ton of that. And I think some of it, and part of why we haven't really seen a lot of bipartisanship, at least in Congress, is that there's very little incentive for members of Congress to engage in it. There's very little electoral payoffs to joining with the other side. And so I think that's part of why we're not seeing it, right? So you'll hear people lamenting, oh, I wish things in Congress were a little bit more bipartisan. But what incentive do Democrats or Republicans have to team up with the other party? They can get punished for it, but the benefits aren't so great. Both electorally and there's some research suggesting that donors don't really reward working with the other side. And so I think increasingly we're not seeing a whole lot of bipartisanship for those reasons.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Mike and I were talking earlier before this started about Gavin Newsom and his podcast. And I think one of his many podcasts. And I think it sort of goes to this. I think that there is no bipartisanship to be had from the Republicans, right? They don't need bipartisanship for the most part. And they don't want it because it doesn't suit their talking points and their agenda. So then it falls onto Democrats. What can they do to make themselves relevant? And I think that there's this split, or maybe multiple splits within the Democratic Party about what that looks like. I think, you see Newsom and love or hate the podcast, you see him trying to do this sort of broad reach into the middle. You see, Bernie Sanders and AOC out on their tour to really go hard against the Democrats. So I don't really know that there's meaningful bipartisanship to be had because one party doesn't need it, and the second party is just trying to figure out what brings traction.
I challenge the whole premise of the idea that we are operating on a political spectrum the way that most of us have come to know it. And what I mean by that is the right-left spectrum really isn't telling us anything anymore. When I was a young political consultant, if you said rich, old, and white zip codes, you were talking about the most Republican zip codes in the country. Today, they're the most far left. That's where Bernie Sanders is the best. The fastest growing segment of the Republican Party is with Latinos, young people under 30, black men, and union members, okay? So we are in an era where the ideological understanding of what partisanship and the right-left spectrum even meant doesn't exist. What we're watching and why it's so acrimonious is what we're dealing with is this emergent populism on both sides of the political spectrum, on both sides of the aisle, that attacks the partisan nature of institutions on either side. That's why there's no compromise that is possible, is we now believe as a people, as a government, as a Congress, that there's a zero-sum battle about academia or about the government or about the media. If you're a Republican, you think that all of those are literally enemies of the state. And on the left, you're not a big fan of the military or the church or businesses broadly. And you can hear this in the language of people in both the Republican and Democratic Party. And what was most striking to me over the past few years has been hearing Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley rail on big tech, and then listen an hour later, and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are railing against big tech. The attack against big literally is an elementary understanding of what populism is. It's an attack on established power. And the problem is We're not having a discussion about whether government should be bigger or smaller the way that we have for the past 150 years in this country. Republicans wanting smaller, Democrats wanting bigger. That has been the two-party system. There's been this pendulum that swings back and forth. We're not having that discussion. You have never heard Donald Trump extol the virtues of smaller government because he doesn't believe that. He's a statist. He's more than happy to use the awesome power of the federal government to get his way. Ron DeSantis will use the power of the Florida government to attack Disney, their largest private company, when they're not operating the way that he wants them to. That is not conservatism, folks, under any definition. What that is populist statism, right? Which is one step away from authoritarianism, or maybe it's the same step. I don't know anymore. My point is, when we partisanize through institutions and view the institutions as supporting one worldview or the other, you can't have anything but zero-sum politics. And when you believe that they are an existential threat to your identity and to your life, and you believe that they are an enemy to you, we begin to see the absolute crumbling of all of these things that we have maybe not believed in entirely, but accepted that that's the way that our society works, which is kind of, by the way, what the definition of democracy is. We're not operating that way anymore, by most standards.
So Tara, I'm going to direct this question to you, and it's kind of building on this sense of disunity and perhaps use of governmental power for purposes that are different than in the past. Some would argue that there has been an attack on the legal profession generally, with the firing of government lawyers, investigative watchdogs, some of these issues with regard to the judiciary that we've talked about. Is this constitutionally problematic? And if so, what should we as lawyers and citizens be thinking about it, doing about it? How should we be perceiving this?
Well, you know, when the government goes after law firms, sometimes they litigate. Not all of them are, but some of them are, and so that's the fight right now. So one law firm representing by famous appellate conservative lawyer Paul Clement is challenging some of these actions and saying this violates free speech. It also violates the separation of powers because Congress didn't allow you, Mr. President, to decide X and Y and Z related to law firms. The very move itself, I think, is telling, right? Because I think there are many institutions in society that thought they were not likely to be touched by any administration, Republican or Democrat. I think giant law firms were one of them. I think many people who hadn't done some reading thought the civil service was another. There are many institutions that are now being very much under the gun that weren't under the gun in Republican or Democratic administrations. And I think this gets to a broader point that connects to some of what people have said, a real lack of faith in institutions in our society. I'll be the first to confess, I'm an institutionalist. I believe in institutions. I go to church every Sunday. I believe in that institution. I believe in university institutions. I used to work at the Department of Justice. I believe in government institutions. I know what people have always said about government workers, that, oh, they're lazy, they don't do very much. In some cases, that's true, but the bulk of my experience working in government was that people were taking jobs that paid far less than they might have otherwise been able to make because they wanted to serve their country, and that's why they were there. And so this kind of built my own faith in institutions. And it's not just those institutions, right? The judiciary is another institution that's getting attacked from the left and the right, as I mentioned before, including the Supreme Court, as we've heard on this panel. Has the Supreme Court made decisions that I disagree with? Yes. Since its founding. One of the questions that I ask my students, my upper level students on the first day, I give them a questionnaire. And I say, one of the questions is, if you could reverse any Supreme Court precedent, what would it be? And I hope some of you are like thinking through this. What might it be? Maybe some recent ones for some of you. But there are two answers I've never gotten. One, well, I would never reverse any Supreme Court precedent because they've always gotten it right. No one has ever said that. And the other answer I've never gotten is, well, you can't reverse a Supreme Court precedent because stare decisis. Also never heard that. I mention this just to say that throughout our history, the Supreme Court has been a lightning rod of attacks, more so since from the mid 20th century on, because it's been doing a lot more stuff that matters to a lot more people, a lot of it very, very good. But I do think it's important when we talk about the Supreme Court and how it's, and say things like it's hurt itself, and I'm no fan of some of the ethics discussions going on right now. I think it's really important that when we talk about our institutions that way, that impacts the long-term public faith in those institutions too. And so if we're worried about attacks on judges and calls for impeachment of judges, this is part and parcel of broader attacks that our judiciary has faced going back more than a decade now, really, really hard attacks and far into our past for many other attacks from both the left and the right. One of the things that I have been saying for a number of years is that if you want to shore up institutions, we need to actually talk about them with respect, even if we strongly disagree with what members of those institutions are doing at a particular point in time. Do I disagree with things that this current Roberts Court has done? Of course. Do I think this current Roberts Court is under the control of any political actor? No, I do not. And one of the things I am thankful for when I look across our federal judiciary is that there are judges, some of whom probably came from more conservative leanings and some of whom came from more progressive leanings, all of whom, or most of whom at least, always an exception to every rule, but the vast majority of whom believe in the rule of law. And I also just want to say one quick thing about Congress. The only way that our system survives is if political actors believe in it too. And so one thing that gave me some joy reading the news earlier today, and I don't get much joy from news these days, Republican members of the Senate were pushing back on those impeachment calls. That is crucially important. And I think people need to be pushing back on a lot more than that.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'm going to jump back in. I don't think anybody, I consider myself an institutionalist also. It's why I've changed not only my voting behavior, but why I lit my own career on fire, because I saw the danger that one party, my own party, represented. A great threat to my own personal safety and my family's safety. I'm a huge defender of the institutions that built this great country. It's why I take particular umbrage, not at the decisions that the court's been making, but I don't believe, for example, that a Supreme Court justice should be getting paid trips to Alaska, hunting and fishing trips for people that he's going to be deciding cases on later in that session. Call me old-fashioned. Maybe I don't understand the way ethics works anymore. I believe that if your wife was being paid by people who were also financing what was an insurrection to overthrow our government over legitimately held election, that's a problem, especially if you don't recuse yourself from decisions that are being made. I mean, is that? I don't think that doesn't hold to me the same standard as saying, Brown versus Board was a good decision or not, or that it's not the action, the legal actions or the professional actions of the church. It's the professional, it's the personal activities of perhaps this court. And is that unique in American history? I don't know. But I do know that there are serious ethical problems that would suggest that there are justices taking money from people upon which they are deciding elections. And we need to be sober-eyed and clear-eyed about that, or we can't protect trust and confidence in institutions. We must be transparent. We must demand, I would argue, a higher standard from the judiciary. In fact, isn't that one of the precepts that they operate under, is the perception of undue influence? Congress doesn't say that. The executive doesn't say that. The judiciary says that for a reason. There's a reason why. I would argue that the judiciary has the least amount of tools to enforce its decisions other than the credibility and trust and confidence upon which it makes its decisions. There's something romantic and beautiful and important about that needs to be jealously guarded if this very fragile experiment is going to go forward. And that ultimately is what gives us belief in institutions. That's what's been taken away. That's what I want back from all levels of government, but I would say at this particular moment, particularly from the judiciary.
Yes.
I'll build on that very slightly and very quickly.
You're next.
I think that there's a nexus between what the two of you are saying that concerns me. I too am an institutionalist. The post office is one of my favorite. I love all institutions. There is corruption that needs to be called out, right? Individual corruption cannot be allowed to stand. That's a cancer in the institution. But we are in this strange moment in time where to call out the cancer is to give those who are against institutions more ammunition to rip down the institution, right? So you call out the corruption, and then the other side says, well, let's just take the whole Department of Education. Well, that's corrupt. Let's get rid of it. Health and Human Services, you are right, that is corrupt. Let's get them out of here. And so we're in this terrifying time where to call out the corruption is to side with the anti-institutionalists. And that's something we have to figure out, because we must be able to call out the corruption without destroying the institution.
Cheryl, did you have a further comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I have been on board for ethics reform in the Supreme Court for quite some time. I think it's important to recognize there were no ethics rules at the United States Supreme Court until very, very recently, and then the court wrote its own, which people have reactions to. When Congress for 50 years, from the 1930s through the 1970s, debated ethics rules for the lower federal judiciary. And yes, I read all 50 years of those debates. And one of the things that came up was, do we apply this just to the lower federal courts, or do we apply it to the Supreme Court too? Some members of Congress suggested applying it to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, they decided not to. They thought it would be too much of an interference with the separation of powers. What that means, whenever you read, frankly, a lot of discussions of separation of powers, the term's kind of thrown out there without a lot of meat. But they thought it would just sort of be a problem for Congress's relationship with the Supreme Court. So in 1980, when Congress enacted a statute for ethics rules, it was just for the lower federal judiciary. And so some of the things that the Supreme Court justices have done, both Democratic appointed judges and Republican appointed judges, could not have been done by lower federal courts. In 2016, when Donald Trump was running for president the first time, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for reasons I don't understand, told the New York Times all sorts of choice things about her views of the presidential candidate. And I don't know what led her to say this, but she said it not just to the New York Times, but several other news outlets. She called him a faker and various other things. I will tell you, when I first read this, I was sitting with my mom at a breakfast table, and I just started yelling at my poor mom. I was like, what is she doing? Judges shouldn't be doing this. Now, why do I say judges shouldn't be doing this? If then Justice Ginsburg had been on the D.C. Circuit, as she previously was, it would have been a violation of the rules of the D.C. Circuit to be talking about a candidate for public office. But because she was a Supreme Court justice, she didn't violate anything. Now, a few days later, Justice Ginsburg did apologize for these remarks and say her words were not well spoken. I mentioned this example not to say that this is at all equivalent to some of the things that have happened recently, but just to say that there should be ethics rules for the Supreme Court, and there are not, which doesn't excuse the behavior of some judges. I think that anyone can use some common sense, or at least I hope that people can use some common sense in how they interact with their communities and their social groups. But there has to be a rule for there to be a violation. And so I think it's crucially important that we have those rules, and I think we can advocate for those rules without attacking any particular individual and without attacking the institution. I really appreciate your comment. I think that is one of my points here. The more that people call judges lawless, say things like stare decisis is for suckers, say things like the court runs on vibes rather than law, this isn't just, interesting. It has an impact on people's view of the judiciary and not just the Supreme Court. People's views of the Supreme Court are very likely to trickle down to their views of the federal judiciary as a whole. And I think we should recognize that everybody makes mistakes, everybody is fallible, and also remember that when Brown versus the Board of Education was decided, it was not received in a warm and welcoming way. The justices were attacked. They were terrified that the decision would not be enforced, and they actually issued a really bad decision, I think, making sure their decision would not be enforced because they expected so much recalcitrance. There were calls to impeach Chief Justice Warren at that time. Everything that is being said now has been said before. And so one of the things that I always say, like when you're thinking about court reform or attacks on the judiciary, just imagine that your worst nightmare of a president has been elected president. Just imagine. And ask yourself, would you want that person doing any of the things that you thought would be a good idea a year ago?
Did you have?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to pick up on Tara's comment about public perceptions of the judiciary and the Supreme Court and how that's so important. And it's pretty clear from sort of, if you look at kind of public opinion data, trust is declining in the judiciary as well as the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is if you start looking more recently about partisan, right, if you look among Democrats and Republicans, their sort of trust in the Supreme Court kind of depends on who controls it. So Republican trust in the Supreme Court is actually quite high at the moment. But I think that this really matters in this question of kind of public perceptions and kind of public trust in institutions. I think it matters especially for the judiciary because as sort of Mike and some of the other comments have gotten at is the judiciary doesn't have a whole lot of enforcement power. They really have to kind of care about their legitimacy and their sort of, the sort of kind of goodwill and kind of belief and trust that people, especially the public, have in them. And so I think that, this is something that's really important because judges, they're often referred to as the weakest branch for that reason. But then I guess this sort of brings me back to our earlier discussion then. So we have to care about what the public thinks of the judiciary, the Supreme Court. But this brings me back to our earlier conversation about this kind of fragmented news environment that we find ourselves in, right? So are people who've walled them off from kind of, mainstream news, are they hearing about, Republicans in the Senate pushing back against these calls for impeachment? Are the Newsmax watchers out there, are they, right? They're likely just hearing about these horrible judges that are, need to be impeached because they, decided this way or that way. And so I think, it's hard to think about, I think public perceptions of the judiciary are important, but then I think when you think about that and people getting these very different messages about the judiciary, depending on the news outlet they're watching, I think that is a problem or an obstacle to kind of rebuilding trust in the judiciary and institutions in general.
So I want to take some time to open the floor for questions. We could obviously talk about this all evening. There's so much here. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface, but I want to see if anyone in the audience has questions for our panelists so that we can continue this discussion in an interactive way. Let's see, do we have a microphone or anything? No, we don't? Okay. Okay, why don't you ask?
As an 88-year-old who was unfortunately in control of the remote for my computer most of the day, I would get pretty upset by the end of the night just from the news I could see. I'd like any of you, especially you young ladies, who have dealt with the Supreme Court in your teaching and study, to see what power the support that we have. These are all opinions that people write, and they don't they say that the law has been broken or it hasn't been broken. But what I'd like to know that so I can feel better. And then you know the answer to that too. I'd like to hear it.
So first of all, thank you for calling me young lady. I don't hear that as often now. I take the question to be, just in case people didn't hear the question, when the Supreme Court issues a decision, how can it ensure that people listen? Is that about right? And
The rest of the government is
so I think that one of the things that I think is really important to understand about our society, and one of the reasons I am so concerned about the attacks on the judiciary, is that as Alexander Hamilton said many, many years ago in Federalist 78, the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Right? They issue the decisions, and we rely on norms and conventions to make sure that people obey them. Can judges hold someone in contempt? Yes. Can they even toss someone in jail if they violate a court order? Yes, but as you get up the food chain, that becomes really complicated. So that's not so easy to do. And so one of the things that's been really, really important in our society is that executive officials comply with federal court orders. One of the things that does give me hope about our current political moment, with some confusion at best about some situations, this administration has said we must comply with federal court orders. I think there are some questions about whether that will continue to be the case. If it does not continue to be the case, we have a very different constitutional system than we have right now. But as long as that is the case, I think it's just crucially important that we recognize there's not much courts can do if people stop believing in the judiciary and the rule of law. And now you can understand the motivation behind many of my remarks tonight.
Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I would agree. Well, go ahead, Tom. We'll just keep going with the conversation.
But I just come back to something you all talked about. It is like the difference between facts, the political narratives, truth, and misinformation. And ask each of you, if you could wave a wand, we talked about the problem. If you could wave a wand, how can we get Americans to have a little more interest in finding the truth? And how can we combat so much misinformation? Because we can't fix the problem unless we get closer to agreeing on the truth.
I think I'd get rid of social media. This might be a controversial comment. I say this as a non-social media user, so easy for me to say. I think, if I could wave a magic wand, to me, the social media is sort of problematic in two ways. One we've talked a lot about, which, you can select, or even these algorithms will select for you news stories based on what you've previously read. And so there's that aspect, right? This kind of self-selection. I'm going to pick things to read that I already agree with. I think the second thing that we have talked about less, but I think is also important, is the megaphone that social media provides people that, I think previously were relegated to kind of the fringes or the sidelines. Now anyone can have, not anyone, but you can amass a bunch of followers and, lay out what might have been sort of fringe views or extreme views, and you can connect with people very easily in a way that I think you couldn't previously. And so, all of a sudden you have people being able to coordinate on something like, January 6th, or, hey, I have this kind of conspiracy theory, and, most people don't believe it, but with social media, you can very easily kind of coordinate and network with those few people that do believe it. And so that would be, if I had a magic wand.
Go for it.
Let me say that Benjamin Franklin was a notorious peddler of misinformation. William Randolph Hearst made an empire out of it. So did Mr. Pulitzer, who we named the journalistic prize after. These were men who redefined the history of America with misinformation. Let's remember, the Spanish-American War, yellow journalism, they called it. We call it fake news. They called it yellow journalism. We got into war with Spain based off of a lie, which Teddy Roosevelt was more than happy to take advantage of. This is not a new phenomenon, right? But the scalability of it certainly is a part of it. I think, and the reason I mentioned de Tocqueville earlier was because when the nature of the way we interact as human beings, when the nature of community has changed, the nature of interest changes. Even in our great Civil War, it was obviously about slavery, but it shouldn't be a coincidence that it was a North and South. There was a geographical component to this as well, where you could rally community. The Missouri Compromise, the expansion of that territory, the expansion of that geography is what made it as much of a problem as anything else. And so misinformation is a problem. We need to do everything we can to stamp it out, but let's also recognize that it has always been a part of us. And it will always be here in some insidious form or another. I'm not trying to excuse it or dismiss it, but what I am saying is we have to be mindful of the fact that it's not just social media that is allowing us to get bad information and start to believe it. It's allowing us to build communities of interest beyond geography, which our system is not designed to protect us against because it was never envisioned. And those may sound like very small differences, but I think they're actually the crux of what the real problem is.
I'll give a quick answer as a journalist. As most of you will probably agree that the average serial killer has more trust than the average journalist these days. And so there is no source of information. And my personal answer to this is, this has been going on for a while. I made the decision personally to switch from being a straight news writer to writing opinion because of this very issue. Because I think that the only thing that you can do to combat that as a journalist is to be 100% transparent. And so I really wanted to be able to tell you, I am giving you these facts that I have reported, and I've done all the work, but I'm not going to hide that this is what I think about them. And I think that that's where journalism is getting in trouble. Rather than going forward and sort of saying, yes, we do have a point of view, and we're going to be very transparent about it. They're trying to retreat into this impartiality that never existed, quite frankly. We've always had liberal and conservative media and left and right. And so for what I teach my kids, I have 2 teenagers, is know who you're getting your information from. Not just where, but who that person is and what their viewpoint is, and are they doing the work to make sure that their facts are true, however they're presenting them. And I think it's just media literacy. We have to start with our kids and teach them how to make those choices.
So I just want to second these points and also second the point that this is not new. So in our earliest years in the 19th century, we had Democratic, Republican, and Federalist newspapers, right? And they were not the same, and they were not printing all the same stuff. The Federalists, John Adams Federalists, who passed the Sedition Act, which said you can't attack basically your government, they did so because they believed the public could be so easily misled. Every time I reread these quotes of the Federalists from the late 18th, early 19th century, thinking, yeah, the public can be misled. But their response was, so you can't criticize the government, right? Like, that's not really something that we want. We've had major problems with media throughout our history, including today. And I think it is true that there are choices not only about the perspective that media offers, but also what they're covering and what they're not. And that's a really, really hard choice. And I'm sure it's very, very difficult to figure out what to cover and what not to. But I was stunned by some of the things that were not being covered by pretty prominent, allegedly nonpartisan or bipartisan media outlets in the lead up to the 2024 election. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that people from different political backgrounds talk to each other. And not on social media. I don't know that I would ban it. I have this like free speech thing. But I do think we need to actually sit down and talk to people and listen, and even more listen to people from a completely different perspective, even when they're saying things to you that you're like, I don't think that's right. Actually just listen and treat people as human beings and recognize that people are human beings and talk in person. I think that's what our society so desperately needs, because one thing that we had before the internet, and I think everybody's recognizing that it really has changed the way we interact with people. Even if you were getting your information only from the Democratic Republican newspaper, or only from the Federalist newspaper, or only from Hearst, you still chit-chatted with your neighbors who might be from anywhere. So I think that's the magic wand that I would like to see happen in our society.
Thank you all. It is coming up on 7 o'clock, so I wanted to make sure that we wrap up on time, but I hope our panelists will stay. We have food and drinks, and if you would like to ask them questions, hopefully we will have the opportunity to do that. But I wanted to say thank you again to Mike Belote for sponsoring this lecture series, to the Dean for the warm welcome, and to our incredible panelists. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all.